So, in a twist that I feel I really should have seen coming, Dan Schneider has alleged defamation from the Quiet on Set docuseries. My name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I have talked about this docuseries a few times already on this channel, though you don't have to have seen those videos to understand this one. I'm a lesbian and a feminist, and the current cultural discourse around Nickelodeon personally fascinates me, so it's something I've been kind of commenting on the zeitgeist around for the last few months. I have more videos in the pipes about Quiet on Set and my personal complaints with them, but my complaints are not the same as Dan's complaints, and I just kind of thought maybe we would go over what Dan is alleging is defamatory here. So Dan Schneider is bringing this complaint against a few people. I will have the thread linked below if you want to look at the entire complaint. We're going to be going over most of it, but I'm not going over it beat by beat because that would make the video longer than it needs to be. But we can see that he is bringing the complaint against Warner Brothers, Discovery, Max, Mary Robertson, and Emma Schwartz, the last two being the director executive producer duo of the Quiet on Set docuseries, and everyone else being involved in some extent to production or distribution of the show. So the complaint states that the defendants falsely imply that Schneider, a well-known television producer, creator, and or writer responsible for some of history's most beloved children's television shows, sexually assaulted the children who worked on his television shows. These statements are fabrications. The complaint goes on to mention, again, the success of his shows, specifically pointing to All That, The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, iCarly, Victorious, Zoe 101, saying that they, quote, launched the careers of numerous young actors and burgeoning writers who, to this day, attribute much of their success to Schneider. It then says in paragraph 3 here, Quiet on Set's portrayal of Schneider is a hit job. While it is indisputable that two bona fide child sexual abusers worked on Nickelodeon shows, it likewise is indisputable that Schneider had no knowledge of their abuse, was not complicit in the abuse, condemned the abuse once it was discovered, and, critically, was not a child sexual abuser himself. But for the sake of clickbait, ratings, and views, or put differently, money, defendants have destroyed Schneider's reputation and legacy through the false statements and implications that Schneider is exactly that. So, like most defamation claims, I don't see this as being strange. It tries to kind of preemptively respond to arguments that it sees the defense trying to make, saying that they're going to point out what they did get right, and so the prosecution, Dan's team, is saying Dan will be the first to admit that some of what they said in the documentary is true. Though what he's taking credit for here is that he was, quote, was blind to the pain that some of his behaviors caused certain colleagues, subordinates, and cast members. He will regret and atone for this behavior the rest of his life. But one thing he is not, and the one thing that will forever mar his reputation and career, both past and present, is a child sexual abuser. So from here, the complaint goes on, basically, again, just listing who they're suing, where, and why. It also sets a precedent for defamation that says that the issue is whether the gist or sting of statements and graphics together imply a defamatory meaning to the average person. And in paragraph 17, it says the fact that an implied defamatory charge or insinuation leaves room for interpretation does not mean that it is not defamatory. Meaning, if you say everything leading up to the defamatory thing about somebody, it can be ruled that that is still you defaming them. So that's the complaint, basically, that they left things up to the imagination and that there were conclusions that the directors were wanting the audience to draw that, a reasonable person wouldn't notice is an extrapolation of what Dan is actually being accused of. It takes a lot of issues with, quote, voiceovers and graphics in Quiet on Set and its trailer, juxtaposed or edited with visual depictions, purposefully and intentionally defamatory in that they falsely and repeatedly state or imply that Schneider is a child sexual abuser and committed crimes in this regard, and have been interpreted as such by countless average, ordinary, or reasonable viewers. Also on page 6, while detailing the complaints against the trailer, he says that The implication between the 38-second connection linking Schneider and his work with children on the one hand, followed by the words true crime event on the other, could not be more clear. Schneider committed a crime, a true crime, and one involving children. This is false. The ID logo only emphasizes this false and defamatory implication, it says.
He launched the careers of child actors who became major stars.
For 20 years, he shaped children's entertainment and culture.
Thank you for being here.
But that marked one of the darkest chapters.
This goes on for a little longer. He's really mad about them using the production company logo in the thing that they produced. I don't see this one being very convincing in the jury trial he's apparently asking for, but I think they have to kind of throw whatever they can at the wall here. So they're saying like, oh, you're a true crime network. You accused me of a crime. That's defamation. Page 7 here. The trailer then doubles down on the implication that Schneider is not only a criminal in some way connected to children, but an abuser, or more specifically, a child sexual abuser. Immediately after the true crime graphic, the trailer cuts to a photograph of Schneider as the voiceover states,
Working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship.
Dan's treatment of people on his shows was an open secret.
The phrase, an open secret, is a loaded one, says the lawyer. An Open Secret is a 2014 documentary that exposed child sexual abuse in the film industry in California. The film had nothing to do with Schneider and does not mention him in any way whatsoever. This feels incredibly flimsy to me, because that is, yes, the title of a documentary that dealt with stories of child sexual abuse in Hollywood, but it was called that because an open secret is a phrase people very much use, right? An open secret, especially when it comes to like an industry open secret, it's something that everybody knows and nobody talks about and puts words to. It existed before the 2014 documentary, and I don't think its most common usage now immediately ties to the documentary. I think it's just a thing people say. It is just that the documentary was named after an idiom, and then somebody in this other documentary used that same idiom. But again, to Dan's team, they are claiming that this is like intentionally defamatory. Coming back to these complaints about the trailer, within seconds, the trailer depicts a video of Schneider working on one of the Nickelodeon's children's shows while posing the question,
How safe can any kids be in that environment?
The false implication is clear. Schneider sexually abused child actors on his shows. The foregoing image and voiceover, ending at the 66th second of the trailer, is immediately followed at the 70th second.
There would be even bigger problems down the line with actual pedophiles on set.
70 seconds in, Schneider remains not only the main focus of the trailer, but the sole focus.
These are 3 predators who worked at Nickelodeon, all in a short amount of time.
The ordinary viewer will interpret the voiceover to mean exactly what the defendants stated. Schneider is a pedophile who sexually abused children on his shows. I know that his complaint seems to largely be around the marketing here, but I do want to say the documentary itself did not allege that Dan was a sex pest towards his child actors. Frankly, even though the things that were alleged about Dan in the documentary were pretty horrible and worthy alone of this man never getting to direct another show, the structure of the show itself kind of does set him up as being less bad than the convicted child predators who were on the set, even though they were sets that he was in some form responsible over. Like, the docuseries makes it clear that he was not one of the people who was sexually abusing children, and it makes it clear that not everything that happened on those sets was necessarily his fault. But almost to a fault. Like, they go all the way to saying, like, there's no way he could have known what was happening, while presenting testimony that as soon as he heard something did happen, he knew exactly who to call to confirm the victim's identity after knowing that Brian Peck had been arrested. Moving back to the marketing that he's so upset about, though, I think it makes absolute sense for Dan to be the focus of the marketing around this series. Dan Schneider was the person that they were, like, breaking news and exposing about in this piece. the person that anybody watching would have name recognition of or interest in. Brian Peck was already known as a sex offender, though with the inclusion of one of his victims' testimonies about the horrific abuse that he suffered, now is more known than previously was. But Brian Peck was never a household name on the level that Dan Schneider was. What this means is that Dan, while he wasn't the only or the worst thing discussed in the documentary, the marketing itself did rely on the fact that he was the person being discussed who people knew. Back to this complaint, 100 seconds into the trailer, Schneider remains the only person mentioned by name, 3 times to be exact, with variations of his likeness portrayed 10 times. The trailer then describes a litany of horrific sexual crimes against children. Simultaneously, images of legal documents describe a police department's sexually exploited child unit. The unstated question posed to the audience is who committed these crimes. With only Schneider's name and likeness offered, the implication is clear. It was Schneider. Again, this is false. The complaint says, at almost 2 minutes into the 2-minute and 35-second trailer, Peck is the first person to be named other than Schneider. His full name is not stated or shown, nor is his image shown. There is no reason for an average or ordinary viewer to notice it.
These are 3 predators who worked at Nickelodeon, all in a short amount of time.
11 charges of child sexual abuse related to a child actor.
Let alone draw the conclusion that it was Peck, and not Schneider, who committed those crimes against a child. And by this point, the damage defendants intended was already done. When the trailer closes with a former child actor victim being asked if he had ever told his story publicly before, the implication remains that it was Schneider who perpetrated the crime. Another fabrication. So after that, the complaint moves from just his issues with the marketing to the documentary itself. In part 3, it says episode 1, quote, falsely and intentionally states and or implies that Schneider sexually abused children who worked on his shows, and says that the trigger warning provided with the show, quote, picks up where the trailer left off by falsely stating and or implying that Schneider sexually abused children who worked on his shows. The trigger warning included in the documentation for this complaint, as well as just in the show, reads, this series investigates the abuses experienced by children from the adults they were expected to trust. Viewer discretion is advised. The complaint also takes issue when a speaker, quote, warns the viewer, literally using the word warn, that if you were a child of the 90s, this is going to ruin that for you. They take issue too with a tweet being shown that accuses him of inappropriate behavior, with images shown mere seconds thereafter of Dan with his arm around a child actress and then his hand on the back of that same child actress, is how they categorize it. Paragraph 31 says, quote, to aid the viewer's understanding, or more accurately misunderstanding, of Schneider as a children's predator, episode 1 turns to the purported perversion of the television content he created or wrote. Schneider, quote, made these children do things that were very weird. Quote, there were all these setups that referenced porn, end quote. These statements color the inference set up by the trailer and are underscored by episode 1's first 3 minutes and its conclusion discussed below, that Schneider was a child sexual abuser. Again, this is false. It goes on to complain that episode 1 is, quote, effectively sandwiched by this theme, closing on the same messaging with which it began. After a lengthy section on adult women's experiences with Schneider in the workplace, quite a way to characterize those testimonies, a voiceover questions how safe can any kids be in the environment if that's how the adult women are being treated behind the scenes. But there would be even bigger problems down the line with actual pedophiles on set. This complaint says that the audio transitioning to the reporter talking about the arrest of Jason Handy without showing Jason Handy's likeness or name, quote, provides the viewer with no information to conclude that the predator was anyone other than Schneider. I think this is stupid. I think this is a really, really dumb argument. I think even bigger problems down the line with actual pedophiles pretty clearly sets up that Dan is not the pedophile to which is being referred, but This section of the complaint is that, and basically ends by just restating what was already there that we just went over. As a whole, the episode 1 inference from the opening graphic, taken together with the verbal warning, written accusations of inappropriate behavior, images of Schneider posing with his arms around and on young female actresses, discussions of inappropriate, pornographic sexual content on the Nickelodeon show, questioning of child safety, and arrest of a children's predator is clear. Children were sexually assaulted on Nickelodeon television shows, and the perpetrator was Schneider. This is false. As for episode 2, the complaint goes on to say, the trailer and episode 1's conflation of Schneider on the one hand, with the real child sexual abusers on the other hand, continues with episode 2, which finally introduces convicted felons and child sexual abusers Jason Handy and Brian Peck. This one, I honestly think is a little bit less flimsy than the other ones, though still kind of reaching. It claims that it intentionally frames a he that was said referring to Jason Handy in the context of he can get you on other shows, being intentionally linked to Dan by showing a video where Dan is more prominently featured than that child abuser in question. Quoting directly here, in 3 rows of people, Schneider sits in the middle. The viewer's attention directed to him by virtue of his position in the image, and the gaze of a child actress turned toward and looking up at him. In the top row, with his head partially obstructed, is the real child abuser, Handy. By virtue of episode 2's manipulative mix of editing, speech, and imagery, the viewer is left to conclude that, like Handy, Schneider used his position to facilitate child sexual abuse. It also says that episode 2, quote, greatly exaggerates the relationship between Schneider and Peck, falsely claiming that the latter, quote, worked closely with Dan as this dialogue coach, and that, quote, he's very much one of the cogs in the Dan Schneider machine, end quote. Dan takes issue with this. He claims to have had no knowledge of Peck's abuse at the time on The Amanda Show or until long after having filmed the Drake and Josh pilot. That's stated in this complaint as well. Also, on page 13 of that complaint, it says, echoing the precise format used to introduce the above misleading image, the one with Amanda, episode 2 describes Peck's abhorrent abuse, and a former child actor muses, we go through enough as child actors, and for us to not feel like we have a voice, that's worse, 'cause you don't know who you're supposed to trust. That's worse. As with Handy, episode 2 then immediately and inexplicably cuts to a photograph featuring Schneider, not the real child abuser Peck. Only after that image remains on screen for 3 seconds does episode 2 pivot to Peck. As you can probably tell by the way I read that, I also think this is a stupid argument. Dan Schneider is part of not knowing who to trust when you are a child in that environment and he is in a position of authority over you. I don't think they were intentionally misleading what that actor was saying. I think that's it's the conclusion you draw when you hear somebody who was under Dan's authority say that they didn't know who they're supposed to trust. Again, the complaint restates Dan's ignorance of Brian Peck's crimes until the information had become a matter of public record, and clarifies that Dan did not commit any such crimes himself, saying, quote, the only reason to include Schneider's image in this context was to falsely equate Schneider with Peck. The viewer is left to infer that just as Peck was a child sexual abuser, so was Schneider. The complaints after this jump then to episode 5, the issue being there that it, quote, falsely states and or implies that Dan Schneider is a convicted child molester and or allowed them on set. Quoting here, in the final minutes of episode 5, the speakers discuss updating child actor laws, quote, so that no individual who is a convicted child molester can ever be on a Hollywood set again. Then, after describing the loopholes that allow a, quote, convicted child molester, end quote, to be on a Hollywood set, episode 5 cuts to a photograph of Schneider on a Hollywood set, which remains on screen for approximately 5 seconds. The use of Schneider's photograph in this context clearly states and or implies that Schneider is a convicted child molester, which is both false and made with reckless disregard for the truth. It then suggests that the documentary should instead have used images of Brian Peck or Jason Handy to make this point, saying that Dan's picture use here is defamatory because, quote, it states and or implies that Schneider invited or allowed convicted child molesters on the set, in effect aiding and abetting their crimes. So the complaint then goes on to allege that the defendants knew that their statements and implications were false, and that they made and published this content for clickbait, ratings, and views. Quoting the director speaking about the discussion that had swirled around the first trailer after it went viral, paragraph 45 here, indeed, at the very end of episode 4, the defendants admit the falsity of the above defamatory statements and implications. The voiceover, with approximately 10 minutes left in the fourth and final episode of the original series, states that back in 2018, when Schneider and Nickelodeon parted ways, Nickelodeon conducted an extensive research, blah blah blah, we all know that part, the, investigation that was quoted in the documentary that didn't find any evidence of inappropriate sexual behavior with minors, but, did come right before they cut ties with Dan pretty permanently. Again, though, we're coming back to the big complaint here being the advertising for the show, saying that the defendants could have made it clear in the trailer that Dan did not commit sexual abuse against child actors, that there's no evidence of such, that he was not charged as such and did not commit any crimes, as well as the fact that his acts or words are very different than those of the child molesters depicted on Quiet on Set. I would argue that that is what saying there would be actual pedophiles down the line was attempting to do, but the argument in the complaint says, quote, there could have been a graphic or disclaimer to this effect at the very beginning of the trailer or Quiet on Set. Simply stated, the defendants could have been honest. Instead, the defendants, the trailer, and Quiet on Set do the exact opposite. Intentionally, maliciously, and repeatedly state or imply that Schneider is a child sexual abuser, likely to attract viewers and ratings. He's also alleging that by refusing to interview people who would have spoken positively of Dan on camera, they've shown malice and purposeful disregard for the truth. He provides examples of people who had offered to speak positively of him who were not in the final documentary or asked to speak on camera, and also brings up the ambushing of Mark Summers, a host who had been in the Nickelodeon show world long before the era that was being discussed in the documentary, and who very much has said that he felt ambushed and like he wasn't told what he was getting into when he sat down for that interview. On page 17, I think pretty standard stuff as far as defamation complaints I've read previously. It goes over the harm to his reputation and emotional well-being, saying that his career was irreparably harmed as a result. Interestingly, though, it does also mention that Dan was already a huge subject of, commentary YouTube and those childhood ruined clip compilations and stuff. But this complaint, he seems to be alleging that while those did exist, it was like a fringe conspiracy that was never being talked about before, and the Quiet on Set docuseries brought it to the forefront of the national conversation and framed him as being one of the child sexual abusers exposed in the documentary. To this end, he points to the New York Post running an article about the docuseries where they referred to him as, quote, alleged assaulter and Nickelodeon showrunner Dan Schneider, and The Hollywood Reporter also referred to him as a sexual abuser and equated him with Brian Peck, saying in their article that the two of them, quote, got away with years of sexual abuse. The complaint also then shows comments from the trailer that prove their theory that the average person would understand this to be evidence of Dan as a predator. People saying, oh, he deserves to be in prison, that he assaulted children, equating him to Epstein or Bill Cosby. He also demands a jury trial, which I find interesting, and asks for the removal of the trailer and or Quiet on Set, as well as damages, loss of income, and his own lawyer fees. So, that's the complaint. As far as my thoughts on it, other than what I've already said as I've been reading it to you, I am of two minds about this. Because part of me, most of me, wants to say that it's obviously frivolous, that the kind of commentary provided in Quiet on Set should be protected under anti-slap legislation. Like, there's a very real possibility that this complaint is a big ol' nothing burger, and that it's immediately going to be struck down on that basis. That appears to be what happened when noted sex pest and bad children's book author Jay Asher tried to, like, sue the literary group he had been affiliated with after they said that he was a sex pest. They were like, you can't do that, dude, it's slap. And then I don't think anything else happened after that with that. If you aren't already familiar, SLAP is an acronym for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, basically meaning a lawsuit done to punish someone for exerting their freedom of speech or freedom of press. In a lot of cases about alleged defamation, even ones along the lines of what we see here with Dan, he gets swatted down pretty easily, which is a possibility. All we know right now is that he filed, and the contents of those filings, which we've just gone over and which I will link in the description below. Now, I've already talked about some of my misgivings with a lot of things that were handled in quiet on set in ways that I don't think it should have been. I'm planning on breaking that down in more detail on future videos, but just thinking about how kind of shady and ramshackle this documentary seems to have been in parts of its production, I wouldn't be surprised, I think, if they left just enough T's uncrossed to put themselves in a position where they end up settling, though I also just can't imagine that a trial, especially the jury trial that he's asking for, would go well for him. I also will say the part of me that hesitates to imagine that anti-SLAPP protections will fully protect the journalism here, though in most cases I would struggle to use that word to describe this HBO docuseries. I'm largely informed by that, though, with the Depp v. Heard trial. And in that, if it can be construed that Amber's simple statement, interpreted by someone else into a headline that she didn't personally write, was this character assassination of the pirate guy or whatever, even though he was already washed up, I don't think it's fully impossible for the argument to be made that the Quiet on Set documentary couldn't be said to have similarly hurt Dan's career, though I don't personally think it did any more than his own actions did. As I've said before, while I think that Dan's argument is kind of flimsy, I do think that the documentary was maybe less than responsibly made, and that they could have done a lot to close themselves off a lot more than they did from this kind of risk, though, I'm not sure that in a piece of journalism like this they could have been quite as careful as, say, Jeanette McCurdy refusing to directly name him in her book I'm Glad My Mom Died. But I do think it points to Jeanette McCurdy knowing that this was an action that Dan Schneider might take. And I think that he also knew that there was much less to gain from pursuing small-scale creators making videos about this, because that was, usually broke young adults who wouldn't have some kind of settlement to make. But, I think also the cultural conversation around this would have faded out pretty soon if he hadn't made this lawsuit, and that now we're going to be continuing to talk about Dan Schneider for a lot longer than we normally would have. I think he noticed that people were kind of turning on the documentary and maybe thought that he had an argument, but I don't think people are turning on the documentary in a way that supports him. And again, I don't think if it goes to jury that there would be real risk of a jury being influenced to see Dan as the ultimate victim here, because in the ways that probably are most important, the show does make distinctions about what it is and is not directly accusing Dan of, what is speculation and what's backed up. And also, I don't think that the argument that the clips from the show of the inappropriate sexualized situations were, quote, out of hundreds of hours of footage or whatever, I don't think that's credible. I think pretty much anyone sitting on a jury would know what they're looking at there. I'm just not sure how much of the liability of the documentary as a piece of, informative media is going to play into this being defamation. If this is, mostly about advertising. I genuinely don't know enough about that. I think there's a difference between false advertising and not expecting that your audience has the lowest possible reading comprehension. I don't think it's false advertising to not make things 100% idiot proof, but also, to what extent do you have that responsibility when you're advertising a journalism piece? Still, though, I kind of can't imagine this going to court. A friend of mine pointed out that even just by filing a complaint, Dan is opening himself up to discovery, which means, either he thinks he has nothing to hide or he thinks he's untouchable. But with how carefully crafted and directed his little interview after the release of Quiet on Set was. I don't see him giving up the public perception of his image enough to let people see the way he composes himself in court for all of this, or the way he must squirm in his seat when he doesn't get questions that he got to script ahead of time. About that interview I'm talking about this one that he uploaded on his own channel with the actor who played Tebow in iCarly. This was, I think, a lot of ways his trial run at this exact argument, because he made attempts at humanizing himself and drawing these big lines in the sand between what he did do and feels guilty for and what he takes no accountability for and feels like he holds no blame for. If you're watching Dan Schneider commentary YouTube, I feel like you've likely already seen somebody break this interview down, but it hasn't yet come up in my coverage of Quiet on Set because I got so goddamn distracted by Alexa Nicholas and Drake Bell. But if you're not already aware, shortly after the release of Quiet on Set, Dan uploaded that video to his personal Dan Warp YouTube channel. It is, like I said, very clearly scripted, even though it's meant to be understood as an interview. He hasn't even risked, like, a podcast appearance or press tour about this yet. He hasn't had any conversations that weren't already very carefully planned out, and if he comes across as badly in that scripted interview as he does, I really can't imagine he's even anticipating he's going to come across very well on the stand. So, I don't know, what do you think? Do you think it's going to go to court? I feel like if he doesn't get a settlement, he'll probably drop it before any kind of trial can be publicized. You know, he seems to have gotten the chance to settle fairly quietly with Nick after they launched that bogus investigation that, like, cleared him of complaints and also switched the locks so he couldn't come back. And he was, like, given an amount of money from that, you know, is too much and more than he deserved, but that he's probably starting to think isn't going to last him for the rest of his life. Especially not if he maybe gave some of it to the only child actor in Quiet on Set who spoke up in defense of him to provide a positive character witness. Because another person, one of the actresses who gave testimony in Quiet on Set, mentioned after the fact that Dan reached out to her to ask her to speak well of him once she learned that she was sitting down for the documentary, but she did not. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure if she was offered money for that or not, but, you know, she told him she was not comfortable with doing that. I'm not making any allegations or anything. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm just connecting two dots. Somebody did probably get a phone call and agree to speak positively of him in the documentary. According to this complaint, multiple people did, but only one of them did get into the show, and maybe there was some kind of incentivization for that. Not to be understood as a statement of fact, barely even alleging. I'm thinking out loud. I'm connecting two dots. Another big thought that I have about this is that while it feels worth pointing out that there has not been any evidence or direct allegations that Dan Schneider was sexually inappropriate with his child stars beyond, like, the sexualization of the situations he put them in his shows and on his sets, I don't think that makes any of what we do know about him any less upsetting or disturbing. This is a man who was able to accrue such a large amount of influence over basically the entire brand identity of live-action programming on a network that has and will continue to massively outlive him. And he created a situation where many people felt as if they would be problematized and removed if they spoke up about their judgment of the situation. In addition to this and to the inappropriate situations that he put his child actors into, we do also have actual testimony of workplace harassment that his adult writers faced that does still make him somebody who we know to be a sexual harasser. It's just slightly different from the category that he's alleging he was put into by the marketing. And I'm not attempting to downplay any of what he has done or the harm that those adult staff members faced on top of everything else that he did that's getting talked about in regards to the children. But I feel like if the conversation becomes, wow, it's really too bad everybody started talking about those Jamie Lynn allegations when he didn't do those, Dan wasn't that bad, we, like, risk losing focus on the fact that he did very much, in fact, do some very bad things other than that. And we don't need to exaggerate or speculate on what else he might have done to get that point, and we lose our opportunity to even focus on what is actually being alleged when we give too much oxygen to that argument. There's a lot that I don't like about Quiet on Set. I think Quiet on Set comes across as a combination of children's television network TV trauma clickbait and shitty true crime, and it gets the very worst of both of those things. It's as bad as somebody telling you that their video dissecting every single piece of Twitter drama that Amanda Bynes ever got into is a documentary, and it's as bad as a wine mom in the suburbs telling you that she's the expert in a case that she's about to fundamentally misunderstand and misreport on because she read a Wikipedia page and the second article linked on it and decided that she's qualified to provide hours of reporting on it and sell meal subscription boxes or whatever. I don't like Quiet on the Set. I don't like the way that it really congratulated itself on opening up a conversation that it didn't care enough about seeing through to the end. I don't like the way that they talked about Amanda Bynes. I don't like the rug sweeping of the big surprise star's own history of reported violent abuse or the way they framed his reckless endangerment case. I don't like that they didn't respect Angelique Bates enough to give her a full understanding of what they were having her come in and talk about ahead of time when she was the first of this generation of former Nickelodeon child actors to speak out about her negative experiences on set. If you haven't already watched Quentin Reviews' video, We Don't Talk About Dan Schneider, I truly cannot recommend it highly enough. And in it, he talks about how the documentary set Dan up as a sort of quasi-fall guy. He's somebody who has already been removed from the company, and he's an easy finger to point to. Dan Schneider is somebody who unarguably should not have been in charge of as much as he was in charge of. Somebody who caused what I can comfortably refer to as an immeasurable amount of damage, because we really are never going to know the full extent of it. We might have a slow drip feed of every now and then somebody comes forward and tells us their story, but we are not entitled to that, and they should not be expected to provide us with that for us to be able to acknowledge that Nickelodeon was and possibly still very much is a very toxic working environment for children. But by focusing it on Dan, they get to say, well, it's over now. Nothing else is happening. All the bad guys are gone. They went to jail for a little bit or they got fired and now we're fine. And I think Dan also identified that he was being put in that fall guy position, that he was being kind of set up. And they needed to have that because while they added another episode to try to gesture towards caring about meaningful change, this still wasn't a piece of investigative journalism that was meant to blow the lid off of something still happening, even though there still are not adequate protections to ensure it's not still happening. I think Quiet on Set was interested in being a nose pressed against the glass of a time capsule about something we can all feel really bad, grossed out about, and glad is over with now, and then fast forward on the rehabilitation campaign of a man who is clearly very deeply traumatized, who needs to do much more therapy before he interacts with his fans to the level he currently does, or at all. Because now, we can just stream his song and watch his new music video, and the video that was linked off the end of it, that he claimed in one of the 16 comments he left on my video that he didn't embed to the end of his music video, but, he does send it in Twitter DMs to people who criticize him. He completely tries to destroy the credibility of a young woman who he pled guilty to the reckless endangerment of. And that young woman was completely abandoned and disregarded by the commentary on this documentary. I don't like the documentary. I think it was fairly irresponsible and probably shady in ways we don't even know about yet, and I think it framed things in a strange and sensationalized way, but I also do think that Dan got off fairly easy here, all things considered. And while morally I don't think Dan has any stance to protect himself or defend himself here, cynically and legally in a way that makes me just a little bit concerned about precedent, I do kind of understand the argument that he's making, no matter how flimsy I personally find it. I'd love to hear what you think in the comment section below, unless what you think is that all of Drake Bell's victims are liars. Because that'll get you comment blocked from my channel, and I don't care how much you complain about it elsewhere. Hopefully this complaint that Dan is making gets swatted down and this video becomes itself an irrelevant little time capsule, but it felt worth breaking down since I already talk about this docuseries so much here. I have another video coming out very soon that's already filmed but not fully edited about J.K. Rowling and the worthlessness of whatever she's doing and referring to as feminism, so please subscribe if you're interested in more from me. You can also find more videos on my Patreon, which you can find in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone who has supported me, either through Patreon, supporting me on my coffee, or watching my videos, liking them, interacting with my posts. It's seriously, y'all have made me feel like YouTube is something that I can do a lot faster than I was expecting to feel like YouTube is something that I can do. I love making videos and being somebody that you can hang out with for a little while. Thanks for letting me keep you company.